now run you through some of the key findings from the synthesis review on resistance and backlash. As Lorna said, organizations working on prevention of violence against women and girls face numerous contextual challenges and forms of resistance that take many different forms and can, range from institutional inertia, as an example, to pushback on what are considered progressive feminist agendas or attacks in civil spaces, or even the reemergence of resistance from shifting political agendas. And this synthesis review focuses on negative resistance against women's organizations and the fight for women's rights and towards ending violence against women and girls, rather than the more positive forms of resistance, such as feminist resistance that is seen in progressive social movements. Next slide. So to begin, 8 CSOs and 9 projects were identified to be a part of this review, and all of the interventions were geographically diverse and included, worked with a diverse set of primary stakeholders, from cadres of indigenous women in Nicaragua, refugees and host communities in Jordan, fathers in Turkey, women survivors of conflict in Nepal, marginalized women and girls in rural communities in Pakistan, women and transgender sex workers in Myanmar, vulnerable women and girls from Roma communities in Serbia, and finally girl pupils in schools in Armenia. So it's a very, very diverse set of interventions as well as stakeholders that formed a part of this set. Next slide. So to broadly define resistance, resistance can be understood as a form of pushback against change, that is, resistance to something, and it therefore involves an inherent opposition or presents a challenge to something. And the conceptual framework used in this review is based on a framing of resistance to gender equality that maps resistance across the spectrum from passive resistance to aggressive resistance, and from covert resistance to overt resistance, beginning with the framework on resistance to gender equality began with denial and moved to disavowal, inaction, appeasement, appropriation, co-option, repression, and violence. And in this framework for prevention, we added a 9th form that is omission, because it manifested in some of the interventions that were included in this set. So I'm now going to take you through this spectrum, beginning with the more passive forms of resistance. Next slide. So the first form of resistance that CSOs spoke about and shared was omission. And omission really is the absence of, the experience of women and girls to violence. For example, the omission in definitions of gender-based violence in laws and programs of violence were quite varied, across the interventions, and these gaps or these omissions can affect the CSO's ability to fully support its primary stakeholders. For example, the omission of their experiences or poor definition of their experience. And this could also mean, as in the case of one of the interventions, that the laws and punishments that are applied to these cases do not always align with the gravity of the violation. And it sort of makes it harder for CSOs to fully support their primary stakeholders. A second example was the omission of forms of violence towards women conflict survivors in the transitional justice system, which led to the exclusion of women from this process. And in these kinds of cases, CSOs tend to build support and demand for better policy and action at the community level, but they also work to empower women at the individual level to own their own experiences and challenge the social order. I do want to add a third form of omission from some of the interventions which was that many women faced, was a lack of documentation. It's something that we see quite commonly across many interventions, but the lack of basic documentation can exclude women from the system and place them at a further disadvantage when they seek recourse. Next slide. A second form of resistance was denial that there is an issue, and this often emerges from the cultural and social context. And it is a more fundamental form of resistance to the prevention intervention itself, as opposed to a resistance that occurs as a result of or during the implementation of the intervention. And denial within communities often governed by social norms, they're very hard to dismantle in one go, and they need a longer process of engagement. And therefore, CSOs shared that it was very, very important for them to understand the cultural specificity of the resistance and find ways to work with their communities. One of the most common ways was to navigate community level resistance and use community mobilization strategies, find allies who align with the cause. And this involves sort of deep grassroots community mobilization. A second strategy was also framing of the narrative. Framing of narratives is a strategy used when narratives need to be more persuasive to make connections with stakeholders and to challenge justifications of resistance. For example, justifications of early or child marriage when it is favored as a cultural practice, or where violence is justified as a norm. And one example from the interventions, some examples from the interventions, was to frame the gender argument as an economic one, or one around paternity or fatherhood. And these kind of lateral entry points were easier entry points into the prevention debate, but they always have to be contextually appropriate, pardon me, and framed to create a space for conversation. Next slide. The next form of resistance was disavowal, which essentially is a refusal to take action or acknowledge responsibility. And this form of resistance was broadly seen in interventions where, institutions were perhaps dismissive of the issue. This could be intentional from a policy or a directive, but it could also be unintentional and the result of gaps, lack of capacity building, and etc. But what it does is that it can create a wall of resistance. And many of the grantees organizations faced significant pushback in completing their day-to-day activities in the context of their interventions. And I'm talking about the small daily pushbacks that arise when CSOs often become the first point of contact for survivors of violence. And in this process, CSOs become interlocutors between tertiary prevention services and the larger institutional ecosystem, as well as communities. And to work through this resistance, CSOs tended to through engagement and negotiation. Negotiating instances of resistance is important because it holds the process accountable and ensures that women and girls are protected from further violence. And so what CSOs would do is identify potential gaps and weaknesses in the prevention and response system and develop both short-term and long-term risk mitigation strategies. I mean, this also helps encourage stakeholders to own their own body of evidence and to make sure that the process is followed, and it helps break down all the sort of daily minute barriers that are put up by passive resistors. And the quote on the right sort of illustrates this. Next slide. Moving on from disavowal, we come to appeasement, which is kind of a form of resistance where, for example, leaders may appease their electorate while championing progressive change. It's often couched, it often couches active resistance in cultural terms. So for example, where leaders are upholders of their culture, but they are at the same time also representatives of the way of life of their communities. And so there is often a dissonance between their public actions and private behaviors. One example from one CSO was while leaders demonstrated an increased awareness of problems of early and forced marriage, they were willing to show only some commitment towards the cause, but often would not follow through to lead by example or really work to change practices. And the lesson that a lot of the CSOs shared here was that when designing interventions, it is very important to identify where and how support from leaders will be forthcoming and to what extent, because resistance is contextually sort of embedded, and you need to connect with individual people to create a longer term dialogue. Next slide. Coming to more aggressive and overt forms of resistance, we have appropriation and co-option, which are forms of resistance that happen when stakeholders appear to support a change initiative. For example, they may use progressive language in their discourse, but do this in effect to subvert it. And you find this happens when, for example, you are working in highly polarizing environments. So for example, CSOs reported attempts made to appropriate or undermine the broader feminist narrative that they were championing, or they have to manage powerful community members so that they are on board, but also protect the intervention from gatekeeping. And CSOs working in these complex sociopolitical contexts constantly have to evaluate their positions to frame and reframe their claims and responses. and constantly anticipate and respond to opposing stakeholders. Because often when backlash to gender becomes overt, women's rights organizations can bear the brunt of the pushback. And so they really have to take protective measures to mitigate the risks and have a very, very sound risk mitigation strategy. Next slide. This leads to the next form of resistance, which is political backlash or political backsliding, where the state rolls back on its gender commitments, for example. And in some cases, this can have a very significant impact on the lives of women and girls and on how CSOs work on a daily basis. CSOs are vulnerable to shifting political trends, and repressive environments can really affect their implementation. And often what emerged from the synthesis review is that CSOs are forced to adapt their interventions to make them less vulnerable to risks. So following on from appropriation, again, here CSOs have to have very, very strong risk mitigation strategies and resilience evaluations in place so that they can plan for such eventualities and prevent sudden disruption of their activities. Often CSOs build grassroots and civil society partnerships to help them navigate through periods of backlash. For example, if an entity is resisting their work, they can pivot to focus on other entities who may provide support, or really fall back on very, very strong grassroots and civil society partnerships. Next slide. Moving to an even more overt form of resistance is repression and violence. And the distinction between repression and violence and other forms of aggressive resistance is that repression really seeks to limit and stifle activities and often uses violence. And in this context, power plays a very central role. I mean, indeed, power plays a central role across all forms of resistance, but very much so in repression and violence context, because power is the way in which vulnerable groups are targeted. And so CSOs respond by either pulling back to make their work less visible, take a more low-key approach, but also they also find that they have to consistently engage with every level of the institutional system. And all of this sort of contributes towards making their interventions far more resilient. Next slide. Resistance in the context of COVID-19, as with all of the other interventions, resistance just further enhances women and girls' vulnerability to violence. Women and girls retreated more into private spaces, and that made them far more inaccessible to CSOs. There were, of course, practical limitations, physical delays in implementation. Often CSOs had to pivot to COVID response. And in emergency situations such as the pandemic, CSOs have been able to leverage technology to reach women and girls. However, this has introduced new challenges such as access and reach. The main lesson from the COVID-19 context was that it is very, very important to identify and proactively plan for resistance, especially for emergency situations. All interventions have to analyze the bigger picture. They have to identify mechanisms to navigate resistance and all the risk factors that they may face, and have a very, very strong and resilient risk mitigation pathways. Nevertheless, more research is required to understand how violence against women is linked to other socioeconomic factors that are affected by the pandemic. Next slide. Moving on to the recommendations for practitioners, when it comes to resistance, there are sort of 8 broad recommendations that begin with: practitioners need to recognize, identify, and plan where possible for potential forms of resistance. They need to integrate a power analysis alongside all their other project conceptualization and design at the inception stage. They need to integrate risk mitigation exercises into their program design so that they're not taken by surprise. One of the things to add here is that resistance is not something that is easily reflected upon. It is not something that is written about in much detail in programmatic documentation, unless it is extremely violent or aggressive and has a significant tangible impact. It is hard to detect. It can be dismissed as a contextual challenge, and it may not be adequately captured in program documentation. So reflecting on the nature of resistance is not something that is easily achieved in a short time frame. So one of the recommendations is that practitioners should create space in their timelines of interventions to reflect on resistance, and where possible, build partnerships with other CSOs to better leverage each other's complementary skills. And finally, work to provide basic documentation to all vulnerable groups and identify legitimate gaps in state provision and support to sort of be that sort of first response to resistance, to daily forms of resistance. Next slide. When it comes to donors, the first recommendation is to create more spaces for open reflection in monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning components. I mean, going back to what I said, it is not easy to reflect on resistance when you're deeply embedded in the rollout of a project, when you're surrounded by the details of the intervention, when reports need to be written and sent out, when daily tasks need to be completed. And so more space is required. Secondly, be open to funding and supporting components that involve direct intervention, especially when it comes to sort of dealing with the small daily sort of inertia around resistance. Direct intervention can help. Help organizations find solidarity in communities of practice so that there can be more sharing and more sort of articulation around resistance and more debate and discussion across networks on the question of risk and visibility of feminist work. Finally, for researchers, much more research is required in resistance to prevention work. And this is a space where practice-based knowledge can contribute significantly. And especially more research on resistance in different geographical and sociocultural contexts, because as we saw in the synthesis review, resistance really manifests itself in very differently across contexts, and they're always very sort of socioculturally embedded in their contexts. Next slide.